Today's video is going to be on some tips on doing a clutch job on a 996. I almost said the word turbo, but I don't have one of those. Anyway, it's a Porsche 911 2000 is the year, and it's a 996. I'm in the middle of a clutch job and you can see some parts hanging, and I'm just going to give you some tips. And the reason behind that is because there are a lot of videos on how to remove and install the transmission on one of these, but I find that they're lacking in some areas, and I want to focus on just those areas to help people out. Thanks for watching How to Heaven. So if you've watched my other video, I made this transmission jack. Now I happen to have a lift. It's a 4-post lift, and that's part of my dream garage, which I did a series. I started doing a series of videos on how to build a garage, but that didn't really get much interest, so I thought it wasn't really worth my time for 15-20 views. Anyway, I built this jack, and you can see that video, excuse me, it's if you subscribe or just go to my other videos, you'll see it. It's pretty recent. This is my Porsche transmission, and what I want to do is I want to give you a little tip here that was really lacking, and that is how to get the upper bell housing bolt. Now there's one here, and it's about 1130 is where it's at. That is a bear to get to, and the tip is that when you remove your transmission brace from here, you have your transmission supported by the jack, and the way a Porsche engine is mounted is there's two motor mounts, and they're towards the rear of the car. So if you were to disconnect the transmission, the actual engine assembly would just tilt down like this, and that's not good. So you're supposed to support it by a jack, and I'll show you that. But how do you get to that bolt? Well, I tried to loosen all these and I couldn't get to that one. I used double U-joints, extension on extensions, and all kinds of stuff, and just couldn't get the right angle. And then I read somewhere or found out somewhere, somebody said to lower it, and that's the trick. But you have to watch video after video after video to get that little trick. So I'm just going to spell it out for you. This is not on how to remove your transmission. These are just tips and tricks. So what I used, and that was another thing, is you never see what they use. Here's the winning combination in order to access the bell housing bolts on the Porsche 911 996.1, because that's what I have. So I've got a 16mm cobalt socket right there. It's a 6-point. Then I have a swivel joint. Then I have an extension, and this one happens to be about 13 inches. Then I have a small extension, and this is about not quite 4 3/8 inches. Then I have another extension, and this one here is about 3 inches. And then we've got this one, which is 18 inches. These are all 1/2-inch drive. Now you'll note that these two are actually swivel, so they have a little play in them, and that's really necessary in order to make it around the transmission. So here's one more tip in case you guys don't know this, but when you're putting the half shafts on the transmission, on the differential part right there, there's those, they are 8mm bolts. Let me get my hand out of the way. And sometimes if they don't line up, the CV with the connection coming out of the transmission, if they don't line up, all you got to do is jack your car up and rotate your tire a little bit. And there's a little tip to save you from muscling it and wondering why it won't fit and all that. Just jack up the tire, get it off the ground, and go ahead and move it just a slight bit. And you can also have somebody rotate it while you're tightening each of those Allen head screws. So just another little tip. So a lot of people will do the clutch, and it's the first major mechanical service operation they've ever done. So you don't quite understand the parts, and it really helps you to understand the parts. So I'm going to give you a little bit of instruction here just on the basic parts of your transmission. And this is your transmission right here. On a Porsche, it's got the gearbox here, and then it has your drive, your half shafts, your axles are going to come out of here, one on each side. Do you have limited slip? Well, you would know if you rotate this and the other one rotates in the same direction. If that's the case, you have limited slip. The Porsches, for some reason, it's not a popular option. I guess they're lightweight enough they don't need it. The back here, your nose cone, they usually call it, this is where you usually have your output shaft, and it goes to your drive shaft or whatever. But again, this is a rear engine car, so it's a little bit different. Now, the clutch itself is activated by the pedal on the floor, obviously, and there's a master cylinder up there that's hydraulic. You put fluid in it, and it comes over here. And some cars use mechanical, but the Porsche uses hydraulic. Your slave cylinder goes in here, and it's hydraulic, okay? And the slave cylinder, when you step on the clutch pedal, it pushes in, and that releases your clutch friction disc. Okay, another tip. When you need a triple square bit, you can get this one at AutoZone. And so I've tried everywhere, but AutoZone has it, and it's pretty reasonably priced. I mean, you get the whole set, it's $19 or so. They won't sell this one individually, unfortunately. And this is it only comes in this medium length. It's probably about a 3-inch, but it's definitely a good fit, so you don't really need anything else. So AutoZone. So let's look into the transmission itself, and you can see in here, this is called the clutch fork right here, and there's a pivot over here, and sometimes there's a little plastic fulcrum pivot right there, but there's a pivot pin. Okay, here's another tip that I didn't cover before. You want to put a dab of grease, just a tiny bit, on your pivot points here and then back there where your throwout bearing slides, because as it comes forward, it also slides up and down. You'll see that action right there. I put a little bit on your guide tube and a little bit on the throwout bearing itself, just very, very sparingly. And then finally, when your clutch is, your throwout bearing, excuse me, and then this right here is a little spring, and it snaps around that pivot, and that's what holds the clutch fork in. And then your clutch fork slides in and out right here. And there is a metal guide. It's a throwout bearing guide. It doesn't usually wear out. I've seen people replace it. I really don't know why, because it's not a wear item. Here's your throwout bearing, and it simply snaps into the clutch fork. And you want to replace your throwout bearing every time you do a clutch. They're cheap, and it's just not worth having to go back in there. Now here's your input shaft. This input shaft has a small diameter here, and that's where your pilot bearing is. Your pilot bearing's in your flywheel, and it lines everything up. So you have your pilot bearing here, and then you have your splined input shaft. And that's what you're lining up when you're putting your clutch together. Now, there's 3 parts to the clutch that people normally replace, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I just want you to know that when you step on your clutch pedal, this goes forward, and when you're not on the clutch pedal, it goes back. And that's what actuates your clutch. And the clutch is a very simple system that people don't understand, so I'm going to explain it. Now, there's 3 main parts to a clutch. Besides the throwout bearing, which is right here, and I'm going to show you the back end of the bearing just so you know what it looks like. So here is your bearing. This is your throwout bearing. And there's a little plastic tab here on the Porsche and a little plastic tab there. And they just snap into that clutch fork that I just used you. Put a light coating of grease, and by light I mean, you know, it's just a skim coat of grease there. And then also I put a skim coat of grease on the face of the bearing itself, the throwout bearing. Now this one is worn, obviously. You can see the groove cut in there. It's kind of orange looking, that's rust, and it's very, very rough. So it was time for a clutch on this one, throwout bearing. So let's talk about the parts to the clutch. 3 main parts, okay? So the 3 main parts of the clutch are, and this is the actual part that does the work, is this part. It's called your friction disc. And it's made of a material here similar to a brake pad, and it's riveted on. And it goes, this is on the splined shaft, the input shaft of the transmission. This is what does your work. Now, when you have a clutch and you're disassembling it, do it very slowly, take pictures, and that way you know which way these parts go, because orientation is important. And if you notice right here on this clutch disc, and this is a factory, a Sachs clutch disc, it kind of goes in a little bit, and you can see it from the side there. This is indented, so this metal spoked ring is sticking out a little bit. Now, when I took pictures on the car, I noticed that there were some numbers here that came out, and that was a lifesaver, because this disc on different model Porsches goes in differently. In some cases, they tell you that the part that protrudes goes towards the flywheel. In my case, it's a C2 transmission on this Porsche. C2 being that it's rear-wheel drive. It's not really a model number of the transmission. But in my case, this protrusion goes towards your pressure plate, okay? And the reason they call this a pressure plate is because this plate looks like a disc rotor, actually puts pressure on the clutch friction disc surface. On the other side, you have your flywheel. And your flywheel is a big, heavy part. It's got your ring gear on it, so your starter motor kicks in and turns the flywheel over, which cranks the engine. But that flywheel also has a surface that mates with this. So this right here actually floats in between those two parts. Now, since the flywheel is bolted to the crankshaft, it rotates at all times when the engine is running. It's always rotating, all right? Now, this is connected to the input shaft of your transmission. So this only rotates when there's pressure from the flywheel and the pressure plate sandwiching this disc. And that's the key. That's how a clutch works. It sandwiches this disc in there, and then because it is sandwiched in there with all the pressure, that flywheel is turning. It turns your friction disc, and in turn turns your input shaft. Now this is your pressure plate. This is actually bolted to the flywheel. So it also, your pressure plate also rotates anytime your engine is running. And what doesn't rotate anytime your engine is running is this disc. This disc is the connection between your engine and your transmission. And when you push the clutch pedal in, what you're doing is you're pushing these fingers in. And when you do that, it relieves the pressure on this disc, and it pulls apart like that, allowing this disc to freewheel and eventually stop. So your engine is running, this assembly along with your flywheel is rotating all around this clutch disc. And it's just rotating at whatever RPM you're idling, or if you're driving, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. Whenever you activate the clutch, what you're doing is you're disconnecting this, so the friction disc is allowed to spin freely and then to stop rotating, okay? And that's how your clutch works. So when you release your clutch pedal, the pressure, because these springs, automatically goes back on, and both the flywheel and the friction, or the flywheel and the pressure plate apply pressure, and this becomes an assembly, and it is one-to-one. Your transmission and your engine are now linked, and they're turning at the same RPM. That's how it works, and it helps you to understand what's going on. Now, because this is sandwiched in between and allowed to spin freely, it's very important that the input shaft is aligned when you put this clutch together, because that input shaft goes right through here, and these splines and your pilot bearing all have to line up in order for this assembly to mate and be proper when you assemble your transmission to your engine. And so this is the key. When a lot of people, if this is misaligned, you're going to be sitting under that car, pushing that transmission in and out and in and out. This is the key. The key is do your alignment, get it right, and your life becomes easier. Another tip, when you're putting your clutch in, and that friction disc material and everything else that gets sandwiched in there, it gets sandwiched in there and it's in. One of the things you don't want to do, and not many people tell you this, is you don't want to touch that assembly with your hands or with gloves or anything like that that can get oil on it. What I do is I use brake cleaner, just like this. And here's from AutoZone. I'm not endorsing them, they don't endorse me. It's just something I use. You can get brake cleaner in many brands at many different stores, including Home Depot. But what you want to do is you want to wash your friction disc and let it drip off. This is fast drying stuff. It will take the grease, the oil, the dirt with it. So hold your friction disc up, spray it, let it drip down. I like to rotate it and then spray the top half again, because if you think about it, when you're spraying, or the bottom half again, because when you're spraying this and it all drips down, it all goes to the bottom. So you rotate it and then you just want to spray it again to make sure that it doesn't drip back down onto your rotor, or you can just your friction disc, or you can just rotate it as you're spraying and let all that grease and dirt fly off. Do both sides, and then you want to do your pressure plate surface that looks like a rotor, and you also want to do your clutch. So don't forget to do that, because those oils will affect the way your clutch engages, and it'll slip and it'll chatter. And you know, if people tell you, oh, it's just going to burn off, why does it have to burn off? Just do the job right. Clean it. And finally, when you mount your slave cylinder, the tip of your slave cylinder goes in there. I put a tiny dab of grease in there. This is your slave cylinder on a Porsche. And right here, this surface is where you want to put the grease on the clutch fork. So that's your slave cylinder. That's what it looks like. And then you have on the Porsche your shifter cables, which are right here. The other thing I recommend is a tiny dab of grease in there. Just the tiniest dab of grease to help things. Anything that moves and has friction, you want to grease up. All right, one more piece of, or a tip, is when you're in here and you've got all your panels removed and you're doing your transmission, now is the time to do your filter. And this is where it's mounted on 911 of this vintage, the 996.1. It's mounted right here above your coolant tubes. That's what these are. Your coolant tubes, they go to your left radiator and your right radiator. And yes, you do have two radiators. The way you get this out is you take these two 10mm bolts off this bracket. That bracket will drop down. And then further down here, you have two more 10mm bolts. Drop that down as well. I like to pop this tube out right here. You want to pop this tube out. It is what it is, but it needs to be popped out. So you take that out, you drop this down, you can take the bracket off if you want, but just loosen it up. Now, the real tip here though is that these brackets, even though you take the bolts off, there is something else. And if you look up in there, you can see there's a little tab right there where my finger is. And that goes into the upper bracket. You want to move this that way and then it'll drop down. Same thing for this bracket. That will give you enough room to get up in here and remove your fuel filter. Now, there is a ground wire. Make sure you put it back on. And this is a connection. You just squeeze and pull. And it has another connection here, squeeze and pull. So, there are two kinds of filters. The one you need for this Porsche, the two-wheel drive C2, is you need the KL, I think it's a KL80 by Mall. That's the filter you need. Okay, that's pretty much it for my my tips. Wear gloves, keep your hands clean, because you don't want to put new parts in with dirty hands. And make sure when you do this job, if you take it apart on at different times, make sure you put your tools away. If you leave them all scattered about, then you forget where they're at, and you spend more time looking for them. Just put them back where they belong, and you'll know where they are. And make sure your batteries are charged when you anticipate having to use power tools. And magnetic dishes. Magnetic dishes are great. Harbor Freight, Home Depot, even O'Reilly's or AutoZone. Get some magnetic dishes. I have a ton of, probably 10 magnetic dishes, different sizes. And you can even put plastic parts in there. It just keeps your stuff together, which is the final tip. Organization. Be organized. You know, research this before you do it. Watch a lot of videos. Figure out how you're going to do it. And then get in there and do it. All right. Those are my tips on replacing a clutch on a Porsche 911. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe, share it. Thank you. Now here's a tip for you that nobody will tell you. Nobody has mentioned this. Now, the slave cylinder up there is a real pain to get to. The easiest way to do it is once you remove your transmission bracket, from here, you lower the transmission. I'm still supporting it on a jack right there. And you can see right here is a little nub, and that supports the engine. This jack is great because I can lower it and raise it to help me with the transmission removal. Now, there's a bar that people make that goes across the sway bar mounts, and then it has an adjustable bolt right there at that point. If you have a 4-post lift, then you probably have this jacking tray right there. And I recommend using one of these little bottle jacks. That's from a Toyota. Now, getting back to the slave cylinder. You can see the slave cylinder way, way up there. And it's that little coiled thing. And there are 13 actually, I believe they're 13 millimeter bolts that go into the case of the transmission like this. And they're very hard to get to. And everybody says, you know, you can either remove the slave cylinder, disconnect the hydraulic line, and then bleed it when you're done, or you can leave it, take those two 13 millimeter bolts out, and just let it dangle, which is what I did. Now, when I reassembled it, I didn't want to wrestle with those bolts. And here's the trick that nobody tells you. If you have your transmission down before you install it, you can connect the slave cylinder and you won't have to bleed it because it's still connected to that rubber line. And there's enough play in that rubber line to leave your transmission and your slave cylinder connected. Then you lift your transmission up, mate it to the engine, and you're good to go. No bleeding necessary. So that's just a little trick.